Joel, thank you so much for your time and welcome.
Thank you.
I mean, this has been dubbed the worst economic crisis in 10 years, especially for Zimbabwe. But we're particularly focusing now on, food insecurity in this instance. How severe is the situation there?
Very severe. I don't believe it's ever been this bad in Zimbabwe. We've got half the population, 8 million people, on the brink of starvation, on the brink of famine. Two-thirds of the population of the countryside in that situation, many people in urban areas, which is something of a rarity.
Yeah, and how are people surviving there?
They're barely surviving. It's hand to mouth, and that is why the World Food Programme and others are stepping up. We, for example, are looking at doubling the number of people in the cities, in the countryside, that we help within weeks.
Yeah.
So we're looking at, by January, providing basically rations to over 4 million people. And that's up from 2 million around about now.
Right. Let's just talk about how we got to this place. And as far as Zimbabwe's, food situation is concerned, what were some of the causes to this? We know that a lot of, the blame or concerns has been put on the, sanctions from the EU as well as the United States, saying that, or even the president saying that it's been quite difficult to progress the economy due to those sanctions.
Yeah, I wonder myself just how significant a factor sanctions are. From our perspective, there are two principal causes, both of which are multidimensional. One is climate change. We've had essentially 5 successive years of drought. We had Cyclone Idai that hit the east in March, and that wiped out a lot of the crops there. And the second major factor is what is essentially an economic meltdown, and you've described some of the symptoms: hyperinflation, power cuts, lack of fuel, etc.
Right. Let's talk about the agro-based economy right now. Clearly, farmers are finding it very difficult. As you mentioned, even the crops are affected due to the drought. I mean, what's the contingency plan for them as well?
Well, it's 70% of the population of Zimbabwe live in the countryside. They are smallholder subsistence farmers. So essentially what they produce, what little they produce, and maize, corn is the staple, is for their own consumption. This year's maize harvest countrywide was more than 50% down on 2018. As I mentioned, we've had years of drought, so it is basically an accumulation of years of drought that's hit people very hard.
Yeah. You mentioned that the World Food Programme is doing what it can to assist the people of Zimbabwe. But, I mean, Joe, let's be realistic here. How long can the assistance last for? And if for a short while, I mean, what other stakeholders rather need to come to party to make sure they join hands in assisting with this crisis?
That's a very, very good question, because notwithstanding how significant our scale-up is going to be, how acute the needs are, and they must be met, this kind of emergency assistance is essentially a band-aid. What we need to do with others is help vulnerable communities in Zimbabwe withstand the impacts of climate change, which have been getting worse and which the scientists tell us are going to get worse in the years ahead. So WFP has significant programs in that respect in Zimbabwe, in rural areas, basically helping communities plant trees to prevent erosion, build small weirs, dams, reservoirs to retain very precious water for irrigation purposes. Another element of that kind of program is we are promoting the use of drought-resistant crops to move away from maize, which is a very thirsty crop. It requires a lot of water. So we're looking at things like millet and sorghum, which are indigenous and more nutritious. And drought-resistant, as I say.
Absolutely. And we're having this conversation because, drought, starvation, a food crisis can be a ripple effect, or rather cause a ripple effect on other issues. Health, for instance, children being malnourished and not being able to go to school, people dying. So we're trying to avoid getting to that place, but making sure that we deal with the crisis as it is.
Exactly. And the fact that the people who produce the food, the smallholders in the countryside, are also the hardest hit in terms of hunger, that's a tragedy.
Yeah. Well, Gerald, thank you so much for highlighting this issue and for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, then Gerald Burke from the World Food Programme in Southern Africa joining us, just highlighting the reality of the food or starvation crisis in Zimbabwe at this very moment.